Thank you so much, Terry, for those kind words. So I always tell people when I started in this field 25 years ago, I had no mentor. I saw a person with ALS come through my clinic when I was a resident at Duke. I thought it was the most amazing and most terrible condition I'd ever come across. And I was horrified when my attending walked into the room and said, "This is what it's called. We don't know why it happens and there's nothing we can do for it. The person just has to go home and get their affairs in order." And I said, that's not right. And I decided I would stay at my institution and try to build a program. And really one of the first people that I met that's been a mentor my whole career is Terry Patterson. And even after all these years, I'm still looking up to her. Not physically, of course. Still learning from you, Terry. Nobody does it better. So thank you. And I feel really fortunate to be invited back. I think this is my third time in 25 years, so it's really nice to be invited back. Love Philadelphia, cheesesteaks, Elvez, some of the shops. And I didn't realize I had actually been in this very part of Pennsylvania before until I was driving in and I saw a sign that kind of gave me the shivers. So I'm kind of an outlier in terms of the way I look and the way I dress and the things I think about. And the reason I got a shiver was I once got invited to play a golf course near here by the name of Marion. And I bought this beautiful new lemon yellow outfit to play Marion. I thought I was looking so good until I got on the first tee and the pro came out and said, "You can't play in that outfit." So it's literally the only time I've been kicked off a golf course because of what I was wearing. But hopefully this is a better story about outliers. I'm going to tell you about the thing that still fascinates me the most in 25 years and 5,000 patients that I've taken care of. It's the ones who do so extraordinarily well, so much better than the average. I've always thought that Mother Nature is trying to tell us something there. If we could just understand why some people are doing so well, maybe we could make everybody do that well. So I'm going to go through a little brief mini review here of ALS progression, and then I'll tell you what I think of as a slow progressor, how I define it. I'll tell you about why I currently think it happens. It has to do with something called the gut microbiome, so finish your food before I get to that part. And we'll specifically talk about an idea for a trial that I've been frantically emailing back and forth with the FDA all weekend to try to get off the ground, a trial of something called fecal transplants. And then I'll tell you about the most extreme outliers, the people who really appear to meet all the criteria for ALS, progress for a while, and then just turn around and recover. In some cases, all of their lost motor function. I'll tell you what I've learned so far from studying those folks. I'll tell you about a target that I've identified in them that I'm going to go after. And I'll tell you about a study that I'm doing with Terry and her team called the ROAR DIGAP study. And then finally, I'm going to finish up with something that I've personally come to believe that all the outliers have in common, all the slow progressors and all the reversals. It's the one thing they all have, hope. And we'll talk more about what that is and how I think I can boost it in this community. So again, I already told you a little bit about this, but my first experience with a person with ALS was not a great one. And specifically what I was taught about progression is that people with this disease always experience rapidly progressive disability and shortened survival. And so we measure disability mainly by a scale called the ALS Functional Rating Scale, ALS-FRS-R. This is 12 questions about different functions. It's scored from 0 to 4, so like if we ask you about your speech and it's completely normal, that's a 4. And it goes down to, if you don't have any function there, like you can't speak at all, that's a 0. And so most people, if you look at a large population, will decline by about 1 point on this 48-point scale over the course of their disease. And then we also measure progression by survival. Now you would think if there was one outcome measure that everyone agreed on how to measure, it would be survival. Turns out not to be true. We actually have a lot of debates at meetings. And so I think the most accurate way to measure survival in ALS is something called tracheostomy-free survival. And the reason is once you get a tracheostomy and you get attached to a ventilator, you don't die from ALS. You usually die from something else. So if we're trying to measure survival as an ALS outcome measure, we have to do tracheostomy-free survival. So it didn't take me long in my career to realize there was a lot of variability between patients, no matter which of these outcome measures we select. So over on the left-hand side of this slide, you see about 40 patients who were in a study who had their ALS-FRSR measured over time. And you can see that some people have a very steep decline, like 2 to 3 points per month, and other people have hardly any decline over many years, so far less than a half a point per month. And there's even tremendous variability in tracheostomy-free survival. So 20% of people with ALS can live more than 5 years, 10% more than 10 years, 5% live more than 20 years without a tracheostomy. This one, it took me longer to understand. So believe it or not, there can be tremendous variability in progression in an individual at different times. So you may be on a slope, and that slope may speed up. That slope may slow down. That slope may stop for a while. That slope may even reverse and go in the opposite direction. And really the first time that I was able to prove this to my colleagues was probably about 10 years ago now. We analyzed a database called PROACT. This is a database where completed clinical trials will usually donate their data. And so we literally have now, I think, thousands of individual patients' data, de-identified, of course. We can't trace it back to the person. But we can see different outcome measures and how they behave over time. And if we just focus on people who were randomized to a placebo, we can see curves like that one in the top right-hand corner. So that's somebody's ALS-FRSR score over about 600 days of follow-up. And you can see that's not a linear decline. It kind of bounces around. There's a long period where it's flat. There's even a period toward the end of follow-up where it's reversing. It's going in the opposite direction. And we did an analysis that's a little bit more complicated. We looked at the percentage of people in this database that had different degrees of ALS-FRSR stability or improvement lasting different amounts of time. And that's what's in the lower right-hand corner. So if you look at those curves, that Duke blue curve, that's the percentage of people who had a stable score lasting different amounts of time. And you can see if you look over a short period of time, like just a few months, there's a lot of people that are stable on that score. But if you want to see the score stay stable for a year, go all the way out to the right, and you can see that it's probably under 10% that are stable for a year. And you also have similar curves for a 1-point improvement, a 2-point improvement, a 3-point improvement, a 4-point improvement. It's much more common to see these over short periods of time. So I remember when I presented this, I think it was in Miami at an international meeting, the criticism was, well, this is a problem with the scale. It's a problem with the ALS-FRSR scale. I'm not going to stand up here and say this scale is perfect, but I do think it's still the best thing we have for measuring progression. And I was pretty convinced already that it wasn't just a scale issue, but I was glad to see that somebody looked at that. So this is a paper from China that looked at stability or improvement over 2 time points in the course of over 100 people with ALS in a clinic. And so you can even go out to time point 1 and a 12-month time point, and you can see not only can the ALS-FRSR be stable or improved, but so can MRC, which is manual muscle testing, where we push on your muscles and see how strong you are. And so can a person's impression, global impression of change. So it isn't just a scale issue. And just as an aside, I thought this was fascinating. I was contacted by a baseball biographer, Dan Joseph, who was writing the definitive biography on Lou Gehrig himself. And he had come up with this table that's pretty cool. So this shows Lou Gehrig's batting average. So if you're not a baseball fan, batting average is the number of hits divided by the number of at-bats, but also slugging percentage, the number of bases divided by at-bats. So slugging percentage is probably the better measure of someone's power. And Lou Gehrig, of course, was one of the all-time greats. If you look at his career numbers, career batting average 340, slugging percentage 612. These are unbelievable. But in Lou Gehrig's last year, when he was starting to show signs of ALS, it's pretty interesting. For the first 2/3 of the year, his average and his slugging percentage were way down Like slugging percentage was 200 points down from his average. And then all of a sudden in the month of August, he just exploded. Like his numbers were higher than his career average. But unfortunately, as the playoffs came, everything dropped down again. So I would argue that Lou Gehrig probably experienced a temporary ALS reversal from these numbers. So why does this happen? Well, around the time of the pandemic, I got my first clue. So I had a couple of patients whose ALS FRSR score was pretty stable for years. They were doing extremely well, extremely slow progressors. And both of them got COVID. And as part of the COVID management back then, there were certain medicines we were using that caused a lot of diarrhea. And you can see from the time point where they got COVID, how their progression just exploded. In fact, one person progressed and died in a few months from ALS. And the other person, who had been walking for years, more than 5 years, lost the ability to walk. So something changed in their body. And I thought, maybe that diarrhea is the clue. And so we decided to look at the gut microbiome in people with slow and fast ALS progression in my clinic. So if you don't know the gut microbiome, we have trillions of organisms inside of us, from our mouths to our stomachs to our intestines. We're actually more non-human cells than we are human cells, if you can believe it. These are viruses, funguses, and bacteria. And it's been known for decades that alterations in this family of organisms can cause diseases of the gut. Like somebody got the Nobel Prize for figuring out that one bacteria, if it overgrows, it causes peptic ulcer disease. Nobody thought that was possible. But in recent years, we've noticed that these organisms can secrete things, chemicals that get out of the gut, get into the blood and go up into the brain, and can actually change things that are happening in the brain. This is referred to as a gut-brain axis. And so I said, let's look at the composition of the gut microbiome in these fast and slow progressing patients. And it turns out it's different. So we define slow progression as people who were progressing at 0.5 ALS FRSR points per month or less. And fast progression, 1.5 points per month or more. Why did we pick those numbers? We looked at a distribution of progressors, and those were way out on the tails. And also, I would say that's clinically obvious when someone's progressing at those fast and slow definitions. And so sure enough, we found striking differences. People progressing quickly had very complicated microbiomes with a lot of extra organisms. People progressing very slowly, their microbiome was very simple, and it had a lot of one bug, which is called P. vulgaris in it. So we said, okay, now we have this association. Is this really a cause or an effect of progression? So we got these mice, which are given a mutation at birth called an SOD1 mutation. It's probably the best studied genetic model of ALS. And we took the stool from the fast progressing patients and we transplanted it into the gut of the mouse. And we drastically spread up progression. And then we took that one bug, P. vulgaris, from our slow progressors, and we transplanted that into those fast progressing mice, and we slowed it right back down again. So this is more than just an association. There really does seem to be something in there that can alter progression. And so now we started to think about how we're going to manipulate this. Obviously, it would be nice if we could just get a probiotic that would do what we think needs to be done. Unfortunately, we haven't yet found a probiotic that boosts that one bug, that P. vulgaris. We're making one at Duke, but that could take a long time. There's a lot of preclinical testing that's going to need to be done before the FDA will allow us to use something like that in patients. And so we started to think about something called fecal transplants. So this is literally just what it sounds like, just like what we did with the mice. You take the stool of a person without the disease of interest and you put it into the gut of the person with the disease of interest, and you hope to change the microbiome. And so it turned out there already were some case reports, 3 published case reports of this happening in China. And in every one of them, the transplantation appeared to be correlated with a drastic slowing in the rate of decline on the ALS FRSR. Now there is already one clinical trial where they did fecal transplants, a trial from China. But I would argue that it doesn't appear that they knew what we knew about what they were trying to do in the microbiome. So that trial was negative. It didn't show any improvement in progression. But at the end of the trial, the gut microbiome looked very similar to the way it looked before they treated the patient. So they didn't even change the microbiome. Now, why would that be? It's actually really hard to change someone's microbiome. Like, anytime I talk about something new that I'm working on, inevitably I find out that some guru somewhere for $10,000 is offering people a fecal transplant. Well, guess what? That ain't gonna do anything except unload $10,000 from your wallet. Because to change someone's microbiome, first you have to wipe it out. So in this trial, people who come in are gonna have the worst diarrhea of their life for the first week. We have to give you high doses of antibiotics and a colonoscopy prep and wipe out your microbiome. And then to reestablish it, we have to transplant you with these capsules that are full of stool from the right kind of donor. A donor that has a simple microbiome that's high in P. vulgaris. And we've got to give you those capsules every day, probably for at least 8 weeks, to change your gut microbiome. So it's not as simple as just going somewhere and getting one fecal transplant. But it does look promising, and I think I made some progress with the FDA over the weekend that we will be able to do this, hopefully probably late summer. Now again, when it comes to outliers, this is something I never dreamed I would see. So in 2011, in the midst of an ALS Untangled review, and I think Terry mentioned ALS Untangled, but if you haven't heard of it, I like to think of it as the X-Files of ALS. I guess that makes me the Fox Mulder of ALS. That's okay, I kind of like that. Yeah, I kind of like that. So instead of chasing down werewolves and UFOs, I'm chasing down reports of people that got better on some kind of unusual therapy and trying to figure out if these are real people, if these improvements really happened, and what exactly this treatment is. So in 2011, somebody sent me a screenshot of a website of an energy healer. And on that website, there was a video of a person named Nelda Buss. And she was describing her ALS symptoms. She was describing her care at the University of Virginia. She named a doctor that I know very well there. And in the video, she really did appear to progress pretty rapidly to where she was paralyzed and was near death. And in fact said I was picking out the outfit I wanted to be buried in, and at UVA they told me it was time for hospice. And then she went to see this energy healer, and over the next 2 years she gradually but completely recovered, all the way back to normal. And by the way, all this happened 30 years ago. She's still alive, and she's still got 100% strength. She runs a farm in Virginia. So I said, I just can't believe this is real, but I reached out on social media to see if anybody knew her. Sure enough, somebody did. We got to talk by phone. She sent me a big box of her medical records. And I remember being about halfway through and turning to my wife and saying, oh boy, you know how people already think I'm nuts in the ALS world? Wait till I go to the next national meeting and say, I think energy healing might be the cure for ALS. So, I mean, in those records, she had the right story documented, the right exams documented, the right EMGs documented. She had a ton of good tests for mimics. And she really checked all the boxes for an ALS diagnosis. And in those notes, I saw her progression to where she was paralyzed. She had no strength left, and her breathing was very low. And it really did seem like she was probably near the end. And now I had this proof that she recovered. So I wasn't quite sure what to do with that. I reached out to the energy healer, and I said, I have no idea how this works, this thing you're doing, but I feel like I have to study it now. And so I'll raise some money, and I'll send 5 of my patients to you for your energy healing, and let me see if you can cure anybody else. And his response was, Richard, for those who believe, no proof is necessary. And for those who don't, no proof will ever be enough. And that was it. He never responded to me again. But the nice thing about ALS Untangled is there's a whole team of us that work together on it. So as we were writing this, at the time there were over 100 clinicians and scientists. Now there's 130 from across 11 countries working on this together. And believe it or not, there's some people on there that are even older than me. I know it's hard to believe, but there are still a few people working on ALS who are older than me. And they said, this is not the first one of these cases. These have been described in the literature since the 1960s. And I said, what? So sure enough, there's about a dozen reports of cases like this in the literature dating all the way back to the 1960s. These were never taught to me. These are not widely talked about at meetings. And when I talked to some of the authors who took care of these patients, I said, well, what happened to the patient? They said, well, we just thought we must have misdiagnosed them, and we sent them on their way. We don't know where they are now. So I said, this really seems like a phenomenon that to me would be worth studying. There's a precedent for discovering new treatments by studying people like this. So in HIV, there's a group of people called elite controllers. These are people who get infected with HIV. You can measure it in their blood, but they never go and get AIDS, and they never take any medicine. They do great. And for years, people just shrugged their shoulders, and then finally somebody said, well, why don't we study them? And it turned out that most of them had this genetic abnormality in a gene called CCR5. And it turns out that we really didn't know much about that gene or the protein that gene made, but it turns out that it's in the surface of all of our cells. And it's one of the key ways that HIV gets into our cells. So these people with that mutation, their protein was bent, and HIV couldn't use it as a way to get into cells. So they were genetically resistant. And Pfizer jumped on this and built a drug called Maraviroc that blocks that receptor, a CCR5 blocker. It works for everybody with HIV, and this type of thing is part of the reason why people are doing so much better with HIV now. So if you want to study something, you got to figure out how to define it. And I decided to set a pretty high bar for an ALS reversal. I've got to have your medical records, and I've got to be able to see that there's sufficient evidence to be sure about the ALS diagnosis by history, exam, EMG, and testing for mimics. I've got to see in those records that you progressed to some degree of disability, and then I've got to see objective evidence that you recovered all or most of your lost motor function and that disability is no longer there. Now there isn't one scale that I can tell you that every ALS reversal has, but I mean I think you can hear from some of these examples how unusual this is. I've got people that were dependent upon a ventilator to breathe and now they breathe normally. I got people that couldn't swallow, they needed a feeding tube and now they swallow normally. I got people that couldn't talk at all, they needed a speech generating device and now they talk normally. People that were wheelchair bound who now walk and some even run. People that had no use of their arms and needed somebody to feed them and dress them and bathe them who are back to being fully independent. So it's obvious that this is something amazing. After a definition, you need to have hypotheses. And I've come up with 3. Misdiagnosis. Maybe this is some kind of ALS mimic that nobody thought of. Maybe there's something different about these people, like the HIV elite controller, something they have inside them, that no matter what they did, they were going to recover. And then finally, maybe they've stumbled onto some treatment or combinations of treatments that are the reason for their reversal. So I'll take you through those. I'll tell you why I don't think they're mimics. So ALS was first described 140 years ago by a guy named Charcot. It seems hard to believe that we wouldn't have discovered that there was a mimic that looked just like ALS but gets better on its own by now, if it existed. These people have classic histories, classic exams, classic EMGs, lots of testing for mimics. I mean, we have a set of criteria that we use to make an ALS diagnosis, and they check every one of them. So by today's definition, they had ALS. Now, 4% of them had a family history of ALS, including some with a first-degree relative that had ALS. I mean, don't you think it would be very strange that a person who had a family history of ALS had something that looked just like ALS, but it wasn't ALS, it was a mimic? Third thing is they didn't get better by magic. So they got better by something called collateral sprouting. This is exactly the way that people get better from another motor neuron disease called polio. Like if you survive the infection with polio, you can actually recover all of your lost motor function. How do you do it? You don't do it by making new motor neurons. We can't do that as adults. You do it because the motor neurons that you had, they survive and they send off branches. And so you look like you have normal strength, you function normally, but if we do an EMG on you, we can see that your muscles are now innervated by far fewer motor neurons that occupy a much bigger part of the muscle. It's called collateral sprouting. And so some of these ALS reversals have had an EMG after they recovered, and that's exactly what we see, evidence of collateral sprouting. And then the last reason I don't think they're mimics is my favorite reason. So a couple of years ago in Basel, Switzerland, we're sitting there, we're listening to a lecture about people who are taking the drug tofersen. If you don't know what that is, it's a special drug that's for the 1% of people with ALS who have a genetic mutation in something called SOD1. And we knew it was a good drug, but what we saw was long-term extension data. People that have been on this drug now for more than 2 years. Did you know that most people have stopped progressing and 25% are recovering lost function, including people that were wheelchair bound who can walk now? So it's clear that this can happen in ALS, and that's the first time and only time I've ever heard people get a standing ovation for giving a scientific talk. It was pretty awesome. So I've got two programs that I've designed around these ALS reversals. The first one is called STAR, Study of ALS Reversals. I'm trying to find as many of these cases as I can, so that's part of why I come out and give these talks and advertise on social media. And I do get a lot of people that email me that say, I think I'm having an ALS reversal. Unfortunately, where it breaks down is we either can't get the records or we get the records and either the diagnosis is not firmly established or the recovery is not obvious. Like sometimes people feel like they're getting better, but their numbers might not support it. But as of today, I have 62 ALS reversals in my program. I've got now all these people in the same database. I've got them in the same database, and I'm studying them in every possible way that I can. Demographics, disease characteristics, concomitant medications, comorbidities. I mean, I'm looking at their genetics, I'm looking at their microbiome, I'm looking at their environmental exposures. And I'll just summarize over 10 years worth of work and tell you these are the most exciting things I found in the STAR program. So one of the people that we got whole genome sequencing on, they actually have an ALS causing mutation. It's called sequestosome 1. So I mean, I feel like that should dispel any rumor that this person didn't have ALS. They had the right story, the right exam, the right EMG, the right test for mimics, and they have an ALS causing mutation. Of course they had ALS, but they recovered from it. We looked for mutations that might cause ALS mimics, like hereditary spastic paraplegia. We didn't find any of those in this group. And then the most exciting thing of all is about a third of these ALS reversals have a polymorphism in a gene, a variant in a gene, which controls the level of a protein called IGF-BP7. So what does this protein do? It's a blocker. I call it the blocker protein. It blocks the interaction between a growth factor called IGF-1 and its receptor, which is found in a lot of places, including motor neurons. And so with less of this blocker around, there can be a better binding of the growth factor in motor neurons, and motor neurons can be more resistant to ALS. And so it's a hypothesis that lower levels of this protein might make you more resistant to ALS. Is there any support from anywhere else except this one very small study? Turns out there is. So in the multiple sclerosis, MS literature, this has been identified as a possible target. IGF-BP7 levels are higher in the brains of people with MS than they are in healthy controls. In people with Alzheimer's disease, the levels are higher than they are in healthy controls. This is a cool experiment. There's an Alzheimer's disease mouse model, and if you inject IGF-BP7 into the hippocampus after you teach this model a memory task, it can't remember. If you then inject an antibody to IGF-BP7, its memory comes back. So it really looks like this protein can have a functional consequence. So has anyone looked at it besides me in ALS? Well, yeah, turns out a few people have. So ALS TDI did a study with me, and they also found significantly higher levels of this protein in the blood of people in their ARC with ALS versus healthy controls. Even more interestingly, I've been working with a group called Precision Life. Clearly, there's higher levels of this protein in two other databases, the New York Genome Center, as well as Answer ALS. So in tissues from those databases, we see a lot more of this protein than we do in people with ALS than we do in healthy controls. Now, one word of caution, with ALS TBI, we tried to look for a relationship between the blood levels of this protein and how people were doing with their ALS. Like we assumed if you had more of this, you'd be doing worse. We were not able to show that. But the study was very, very small, and we were looking at blood levels of IGF-BP7. In these other diseases, they were looking at levels in the brain and spinal fluid. And there is a paper out there that suggests that the levels don't match. So we probably need to look, at least in the spinal fluid. So later this year, if the FDA and people allow me to, I plan to work with CHP and ALS Hope to do the first ever trial targeting IGF-BP7. I actually have a nutritional supplement. It's called hydroxymethylbutyrate, abbreviated HMB. It's something that's widely used by bodybuilders, and it seems to knock this protein down, at least in blood. We don't know if it knocks it down in the central nervous system, but that will be something that we'll look for. And I already have the molecular structure of this protein mapped out, and it's on the desk of my tailor, because if this reverses ALS, I'm going to have it put on the back of my last jacket. Now, that's not the only theory, of course. We're still keeping our options open. If you ask people who recovered from ALS, why do you think you got better? They almost universally say it's whatever they did. Like Nelda really believes the energy healer is the reason why she got better. I think it's a long shot, but we can't discount it. There's a whole field of drug discovery that's based on these accidental findings. It's called serendipitous drug discovery. The most famous example is Viagra. Some of you may know that was being tested as a drug for heart disease, and it was going to be a bust, and it was going to go in the garbage. But the men in this study came forward and said, we'd really like to keep taking this if it's possible. The company did not understand that it would do that, but they pivoted and developed it for erectile dysfunction, and it became a $1 billion blockbuster drug for Pfizer. And so I've decided to create a new trial program where we study things associated with ALS reversals. And what we're looking for is not the same thing that pharmaceutical companies are looking for. They're looking for a very small FDA approvable signal of about a 30% slowing in the rate of decline on the ALS-FRSR. And when a company looks for a signal that small in a noisy disease, they have to be very careful about who they bring in. You got to be early, you got to have a lot of function, you got to be changing at a certain rate, not too fast, not too slow. You got to have a lot of in-person observations. You got to have a placebo control. But if I'm looking for people to recover from ALS, with a signal that big, I can be a lot more creative. I can enroll almost anybody. You can have ALS for 10 years and be in one of these ROAR trials. You can have very little function and be in one of these ROAR trials. I don't need a lot of in-person visits in these. I'm looking for things so big, I could probably measure them over the phone or by video. And then last but not least, you don't need a placebo. If somebody comes into one of these trials who can't walk and they walk again after 6 months, that ain't a placebo effect. So I've done a few of these ROAR trials. Some of you may know I've done a trial of a supplement from soybeans called Luncheon, and also something called ferrocurmin, a water-soluble form of curcumin. Unfortunately, neither one of them reversed ALS, otherwise we all wouldn't be here today. But I did show that this type of trial is much more efficient. It enrolls much faster, and I can get answers at a much lower cost. One of these ROAR trials typically costs between $300,000 and $500,000. Does anybody know what a typical phase 2 trial costs in ALS? It's about $15 million. So Terry and I were talking at a meeting a couple years back, and he said, you know, all the data that we're seeing is starting to suggest that maybe there isn't going to be one thing that works for everybody with ALS. Like tofersen, the one home run, it only works for 1% of people with that mutation. So we need to figure out a way to subdivide the other 99%. And so nobody knows how to do this yet, but Terry and I are the first ones to try that I know of. And we're partnering with a company in Australia called Genius. I know when you call yourself genius, you set a high bar. But they do have something interesting, which is called Deep Integrated Genomics Analysis Platform. It's a way of looking at your DNA at a level that has rarely been done before, a very much deeper level, and taking all that information that you get and using artificial intelligence to try to predict pathways that we see in cell models. And so they believe they have identified a way to categorize everyone with ALS into 4 pathways: neuroinflammation, oxidative stress, disrupted intracellular transport, and autophagy and mitochondrial dysfunction. We're going to see if they're right. So the way that we designed this trial is everybody who came into the study would get their DNA sent to Australia, and they'd get their dye gap analysis, and they'd be subdivided into these 4 categories, and in each category we match them to a supplement associated with at least one ALS reversal that is supposed to work on that category. Astaxanthin for neuroinflammation, protandim for oxidative stress, melatonin for impaired autophagy, and MitoQ for mitochondrial dysfunction. And of course, we're measuring the ALS FRSR, but now we're in the era of biomarkers, and Terry and her team are great at these. So we have a whole panel of mechanistic biomarkers that are supposed to measure these 4 pathways and be able to distinguish between them. And we're using something called neurofilament light chain, which is probably the most exciting biomarker in ALS right now. And so people are finishing up. Our last patient is supposed to finish next month. We think we will have the results of this study ready to present to the people who participated in the study in August. And Terry, I do think we should present it to the participants first. And then there'll be some fall meetings, which Terry and I are hoping to attend, where we present this to the rest of the world. Now, I do want to say, be careful. You know, whenever I talk about ALS reversals, it seems like in the next few days, there's all these new websites that pop up that say, hey, Bedlack was in Philadelphia talking about ALS reversals. We know how to do it. Just follow these 47 steps and reverse your ALS. You know, nobody knows how to do this yet. I promise you, if we did, we would be telling you. It's not a secret. So don't go to some dark corner of the internet and give somebody some money to reverse your ALS. If they knew how to do it, we would all know how to do it. And anytime you're reviewing anything on the internet, on ALS Untangled's webpage, look for these 10 red flags. And the more of these things you see associated with that person or that website, the more you should run. So in the last few minutes, I want to talk about what has become probably my favorite topic, and that's hope. So if there's one thing that all the people who are doing extremely well, whether they're very slow progressors or whether they're recovering, seems to have in common, it's hope. They have tons of it. Now, what I don't know is that a cause of why they're doing so well, or is it an effect of them doing so well? Like if somebody told me, hey, you got ALS and it's going to be disabling and life-shortening, and I progressed for a while and then I recovered, I'd probably be really positive and hopeful after that for the rest of my life. So I just don't know. But I have been reading a ton about this, and I've come to believe that hope is probably more than just an emotion or even a coping strategy. I think that hope is actually a treatment. So across every disease where this has ever been studied, people who have more hope do better medically. They have a better quality of life, lower symptom burden. They live significantly longer compared to people who don't. And there's some biological explanations and there's some practical explanations. But I've spent a ton of time trying to figure out, where does hope come from? And it can come from a lot of places. Some people are just born with tons of hope. Some people have an amazing family, friends, a social circle, what I call an often awesome army to give them hope. But a lot of people identify their doctor as a critical source of their hope. And in fact, there are hope-promoting and hope-suppressing doctor behaviors that have been identified. And you would think they would teach this to us in medical school, and we would all be erring on the side of hope-promoting, but we don't get a class like that. And I'll say I don't think most doctors embrace these behaviors. And part of it is time. You know, we're all getting squeezed. So Terry, I don't know, how many patients they expect you to see, but it's a rare week that I don't get an email that I'm not seeing enough patients. So it's really hard to promote hope when you're getting squeezed to keep seeing more patients. But I've developed an approach, and I would say it starts with me. I know what kind of things I need to be the best me. So I can't stay up late watching movies the night before clinic. I can't be hungover the morning of clinic. And I have to incorporate things into my life that bring me joy. And one of those things is the clothes. Ever since I was a kid, I realized that putting on something really colorful and fun, for me it was like a suit of armor. It meant I was going to be able to stay positive no matter what I ran into. For me, I've recognized that there are certain words that I have to choose as opposed to other words. So I need to focus on the variability when I present the diagnosis. Don't box people in and tell them they have 2 to 3 years. You can't know that the first time you meet someone. And when you do box them in with an expiration date, you make ALS their whole life. Nobody is all ALS. ALS is a part of some people, but there's so many more parts to that are more important. I focus on what we can do. I use if things get worse, not when things get worse. And whenever we have something really tough to talk about, like a feeding tube or a ventilator or a goals of care, we talk about a plan A, which is where to try something new experimentally and try to slow stop or reverse this. But we also say, in case that doesn't work, I want to tell you about this option. This would be good for us to understand where you stand on. That's plan B. I got to get to know my patients, including I got to ask them, what are you hopeful about? Can you imagine how different a doctor's visit would be if you didn't walk in and the first question was, what are you here to complain about today? Instead it was, what are you hopeful about today? This puts a whole different spin on things. And you see some really interesting things that people write on that questionnaire when they come through the door. Things that we never would have known were important to them. Could be a milestone that they want to meet. One of my favorite ones recently was a patient who said, I'm just hopeful I could wear my fun clothes again. And I explored that a little bit more, and she liked the same kind of wild and crazy things that I did. And I started to understand why she couldn't wear those and why this world of adaptive fashion was not stylish at all. So I built a bridge with an institution across my state, NC State. They have a fashion school. And now there's a professor there, Sam Pierce. Every year they have a class called Adaptive Fashion. They start off by meeting with my patients to understand what kind of styles they want, what kind of disabilities they have, and their final project is to present a line of clothing designed for that person. That's really cool, but also adaptive. The other thing that I found recently that's super interesting, so there is a professor from UVA, his name was Dr. James Plews-Ogans. He used to write a blog. He passed last year, but his blog was so thoughtful. And I remember one of the things that he said resonated with me. He said, I love going to my clinic. Everyone is like super positive and they have a lot of good ideas, but they do make a lot of measurements in clinic. And unfortunately, those measurements are very often worse than they were the time before. So I can't help leaving feeling like I'm a failure, like all my measurements are worse. Well, I mean, we do have to measure certain things because they help us decide when to offer options. Also, we need those in the notes to get things paid for. Like insurance really is tough now about a lot of things. But he said, why don't we incorporate measurements into the clinic that don't have to get worse? So he came up with something called the turbocharged living tool. It looks like the ALS-FRSR, but it doesn't measure motor function. It measures your sense of humor and your compassion and your advocacy for others. Amazing what a difference it makes in someone's face when we bring that in. So this is a whole approach that I've developed over 25 years, and I believe in it. In fact, I believe so strongly in it that I had a movie made that kind of incorporates all this. In case I don't find the cure for ALS and something happens to me, I want to leave this behind so people can see this guy found something. Let me see if I can get this preview to work.
I've had to lose one at a time a lot of the things I love. I can't hike. I can lose the mountain I used to hike, but I can't hike.
Before 2014, I think most people knew it better as Lou Gehrig's disease. But in 2014, the Ice Bucket Challenge happened, and all of a sudden everybody knew it by its proper name, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS. As this disease progresses, you know what you want to do, but you can't do it anymore.
We were in New York at a play, and I had some Tic Tacs, and they kept falling out of my mouth. I literally couldn't keep them in.
And so it gradually takes away your ability to walk, to speak, to swallow, and eventually to breathe.
I remember looking at the band and saying, there's something wrong with me.
He lost his ability to walk and could not hold our children.
For every single case, it is a death sentence. Not a lot to be seemingly hopeful for, right? And yet, hope finds a way to muscle its way in.
I'm Dr. Rick Bedlack. I run the Duke ALS program, and I've spent my life trying to figure out how to create options and hope.
Dr. Bedlack's positive energy rubbed off on me.
His clothing disarms people and instantly creates a bonded experience.
I've always found it's kind of like putting on a suit of armor, and I see that it rubs off on other people, so it's a win-win.
Your style is so badass,
Hope is going to be a huge part of what I do until we find a way to end this disease.
He wants to be one of the guys that help cure ALS.
This disease is not hopeless by any stretch. We're making incredible progress every day.
We shouldn't let a single label like ALS define us. We should be who we want to be.
The word was, you have ALS, but let me show you what the possibilities are.
I think if anybody's going to find a cure, it's going to be him.
And just so you don't think I'm bragging, that was my dad at the end. So, I mean, if your parents don't believe in you, who does, right? So look, I've also come to realize there's no way I'm going to get most of my colleagues to ever do all the stuff that I do. But if I could find something very simple that they could incorporate into their clinic that would only take a few minutes, that boosted hope scores, and if those higher hope scores actually resulted in better outcomes, then I might be able to operationalize this across all clinics. And so we've now got a partnership with the Hummingbird Fund and Team Drea to study that turbocharged living tool, to see if we incorporate that into the visit of some people and not others, what does that do to hope scores? And what do more hopeful people accomplish over time compared to less hopeful people? And so it's now open, it's underway at Duke and UVA, and I think Terry's going to join us and get this underway here at her clinic. So I've gone a little long, but I'll just say in conclusion, the progression of people with this disease is absolutely fascinatingly different. It's different between patients, it's different within a person at different times. And I'm trying to understand these outliers, and I've identified some new targets in that I'm very excited about. The microbiome, IGF, BP7, and hope. And I'm going after all those with interventions in the next year. So thanks to all of you out there living with ALS. I mean, it's not an easy job, but the reason I get out of bed every day and fight so hard is because you inspire the hell out of me. So thank you for doing that. And thanks to my collaborators, I couldn't do anything alone. THP and ALS Hope are two of my favorite collaborators, but also some of the names that you see here, and especially my Duke ALS team. They helped me build this foundation of great care upon which all these other ideas are based. And I'll leave you with my new favorite quote, carry a light and you need not fear the darkest. No matter what, it's always possible to find hope. So thank you for your time today.
As always, superb. Is there anyone who wants to ask any questions of Dr. Bedlack? Yeah, Cassandra.
Where does he buy the clothes from? Dr. Bedlack, given that you've isolated a specific bacteria in the microbiome, should or could we look at some gut microbiome work and leaky gut, that type of issue, diet?
Yeah, yes, it's a great question. So we've already kind of scoured the literature, my team and I, to see if there's anything out there that we know boosts this one strain of P. vulgatus, and we haven't found it. We haven't found a specific diet or a probiotic or anything like that to boost it. So we're going to have to make one. And as far as the clothes, they come from all over. This particular jacket is from a friend of mine. He calls himself Impa the Perverse. And he makes, every jacket is one of a kind. And usually he wants to kind of understand who you are and what your story is. So, yeah.
Yes, go ahead, John.
I'd just like to thank you because your attitude towards ALS is the same attitude that John has. Right hands. And it's basically very, very inspiring. And basically, for all the subs that we're watching right now, Dr. Patterson, I'm also one of those in person. So, but the microbiome, that you're actually right on that because I changed my diet too. It's not just the medication. I changed the diet as well. So, you know, I'm not sure if that's the answer, but everybody's different. Yeah. So, but what you're doing there is fabulous. I mean, it's beyond. I don't even have words for it because it's just amazing. And I just thank you.
Well, thank you.
Hi, wonderful talk as usual. I just wondered, you've used the HIV example, but these people that have this mutation, they don't get HIV at all because they get virus. Whereas the case of ALS is different because people actually do get worse and then get better. So if it's something that people have from the start, why does that happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know. That's the short answer, is I don't know why they get it in the first place, but let me give you one more little thing. I might have had it on the slide. I might have forgot to put it in there. So we found this mutation because we carefully controlled for race and ethnicity in our genetic analysis. Like when you don't know what you're looking for genetically, there's a lot of genetic information. And we wanted to try to get rid of genes that might be different in our reversals and our controls, but didn't have anything to do with biology. And since all the ALS reversals are white, our controls had to be Caucasian as well. Now, after I presented this, a well-known geneticist reached out to me and said, I don't believe this because this is so common, this mutation is so common in African Americans and Asians. I said, interesting. And then I started to look at it, I said, is this the reason why ALS is so rare in African Americans and Asians? Because they have such a high incidence of this mutation and a low level of this blocker protein. I've never heard anyone try to explain why those populations seem to be resistant to ALS, but maybe this is it. I don't know.
You're absolutely correct. When you get the diagnosis of having ALS, it's devastating. But hope, laughter, and positivity goes a long way. You gotta keep going.
Anyone else? Any questions? Well, another round of applause for the wonderful Dr.